My neighbor knocked on my door asking to borrow my husband for the afternoon. I said yes. I just really need help with the sink. I have no idea why it's acting up, my neighbor Rachel asked sweetly. My husband Alex stared at me with wide eyes, waiting for me to answer her. I smiled and agreed. I mean, it was only this one time, right? And I wanted to be a good neighbor, especially considering Rachel was newly widowed and probably wasn't used to taking care of the house without her husband. But soon she started borrowing my husband for more things, like moving furniture, painting her living room, even driving her out to appointments that she was too afraid to go on her own. And each time I tried to be the understanding wife, the trusting wife, the wife who didn't question things out of nothing. Until one afternoon, I found it. I was scrolling through my social media accounts, swiping through video after video, when something shocking popped up on my screen. I sat up immediately and clicked on the account. A couples account, where Alec and Rachel were doing couples-only trends together. The one where they rank each other's outfits, and he makes a comment about her being attractive in anything she wore. The one where they surprise each other with small gifts in the middle of a live stream. The one where they danced in suggestive ways that made everyone think they were in love. My heart broke into pieces the more I scrolled through. There were dozens, if not hundreds, posted. But the most recent one was the one that hurt me. Just the night before, Alec had taken Rachel out to a romantic restaurant after work and spent the entire video feeding each other desserts, exchanging I love yous like it was normal. All while I had spent dinner alone, his favorite meal growing cold across from me. I decided to confront my husband the second he walked through the door. Explain, I told him, holding my phone up to his face. He glanced at it and sighed. God, I knew you'd overreact like this. That's why I didn't tell you. I blinked at him. Overreact? Alec, you've been going on dates with her, I shouted. It's not real. It's for income. We're making like $2,000 a month off that account. He grabbed a water from the fridge like we were discussing the weather. I'm between jobs, remember? You always complained about me getting a job. Well, here you go. My contribution. You're welcome. He walked off before I could say anything more. I stayed up all night thinking, was I really overthinking things? I mean, sure, a lot of people do things for the internet, and for the next week, I tried really hard to believe them. I watched him leave every afternoon, telling myself it was just work, just content creation. He'd come home glowing like a teen in love, and I'd convince myself it was nothing. Rachel even waved at me from her driveway like we were friends, like she wasn't playing house with my husband. And I'd wave back like a good wife. And each time I wanted to question it, Alec would show me their posting schedule to shut me up. Then I got home early from work. As I walked up the driveway, I glanced over at Rachel's house and saw them through her living room window. He had her pressed down on the couch, kissing her like he used to kiss me. It felt like a sucker punch to the gut. And it took all the strength I had to take a picture just before I entered my house and started packing. But it wasn't over. 2 weeks after I'd moved into my sister's house, Alex served me with divorce papers. But the thing was, he wanted everything. The house my parents helped us pay off, my car, even our dog that he'd spent 5 years complaining about. I called him immediately. You're insane, I said, reading through the papers. He smiled. You'll lose. The second I mention you're mentally unstable, the judge won't give you anything. I almost laughed. I have anxiety. That's not instability. So, he said, courts don't know the difference. Sign the papers or I'll make this worse. I didn't sign. When he showed up to court months later, he looked confident. His lawyer painted me as an unfit spouse, emotionally unstable, unreliable. Alex sat there nodding along, playing the victim. Then it was my turn. I pulled out my phone. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence of infidelity. I showed the judge the photo of them kissing. Then I pulled up old videos and screenshots of their couple's account, something he tried to delete and cover up, not realizing I'd already made copies in case he'd pull a stunt like this. They've been running a couple's account for 3 months. Multiple dates, romantic content, all while we were still married. Alex's face went pale. His lawyer's jaw dropped. That's not real. It's content creation. It doesn't mean anything, Alex stammered. The judge scrolled through video after video before staring him down. This looks pretty real to me. You're claiming mental instability while you're publicly conducting an affair online? The judge asked. It was for money. It wasn't real, Alex said quietly. So you exploited your neighbor for financial gain while betraying your marriage vows? The judge set down the phone. I've seen enough. I got everything, the house, the car, the savings account he thought he'd hidden. But there was one thing he did manage to steal. My dog. My hands went cold. I called Alec immediately. Where is he? He laughed. Good question. Did you check the backyard? 6 feet under your favorite flowers? I hung up and immediately searched for the detective's number from my divorce case. My fingers kept missing the right keys as I tried to dial. Detective Silas Harrell answered on the third ring, and I could barely get the words out. I told him what Alec said about my dog being buried in my backyard. Silas asked me to repeat it twice because I wasn't making sense. He said he'd be there within the hour and told me not to go to my house alone. I sat on my sister's couch staring at my phone screen, unable to process what was happening. Silas arrived 53 minutes later with a notebook and recording device. He had me start from the beginning while he took notes. I described the divorce, the court hearing, getting everything in the settlement, and then realizing my dog was missing. When I got to the part about Alec's phone call, my voice broke and I had to stop. Silas waited patiently, and then asked me to repeat exactly what Alec said word for word. I managed to get through it the second time. He asked if I had the call recorded or if anyone else heard it, and I shook my head. Just me. He explained that we'd need to get my dog's body examined to determine how he died. The thought of digging him up made me feel sick. I'd buried him under my favorite flowers in the backyard, creating a little spot where I could remember him. Now strangers would have to disturb that. But Silas said it was the only way to prove what Alec did. I agreed because I needed evidence. I needed proof that Alec actually killed him. Silas drove me to my house since I was too shaky to drive myself. The whole ride over, I kept thinking about the last time I saw my dog alive. He'd been so happy, running around the backyard, completely unaware of what was coming. Silas made some calls while we sat in my driveway. He contacted animal control and someone from the police department who handles this kind of thing. I couldn't go inside. I sat in Silas's car and called my sister Anya. She answered immediately, and I tried to explain what was happening, but I couldn't get full sentences out. She told me to stay where I was and that she was leaving work right now. 20 minutes later, she pulled up and found me still sitting in the detective's passenger seat. She got me out of the car and into my house through the front door. I made it as far as the kitchen before my legs stopped working. I ended up sitting on the floor with my back against the cabinets, staring at the back door that led to where I'd buried my dog. Anya sat down next to me and didn't try to make me talk or move. She just stayed there while I processed everything. The next morning, animal control officers arrived with digging equipment. 2 police officers came too, along with Silas. They needed me to show them exactly where I'd buried my dog. I walked them to the flower bed and pointed to the spot, then went back inside. Anya had already closed all the curtains, so I couldn't see what they were doing. We sat in the living room and I could hear the sounds of digging and quiet voices outside. It took them almost an hour. Finally, Silas knocked on the door and said they had what they needed. They were taking my dog's body to a veterinarian named Piper Fontana who would examine him. I asked when I'd know something, and Silas said it would take a few days for the full toxicology results. But Piper would do a preliminary examination today. I thanked him and closed the door. Anya made me eat something even though I wasn't hungry. She said I needed to keep my strength up for whatever was coming next. 3 days later, Piper called me directly. She explained that the preliminary examination showed signs consistent with poisoning. His organs showed damage that indicated toxic exposure. She was running full toxicology tests to determine exactly what substance killed him, but she wanted me to know that this wasn't a natural death. The tests would take several more days to complete. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called Larissa Winters, my divorce attorney. I asked if there was anything I could do legally beyond the divorce settlement. Larissa listened to everything and then said she knew someone who could help. She gave me the number for Klaus Baer, a criminal attorney who specialized in animal cruelty cases. She said Klaus had successfully prosecuted similar situations before. I called him immediately, and his secretary scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Klaus's office was downtown in a building that smelled like coffee and old books. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with gray starting at his temples. He shook my hand and gestured to a chair across from his desk. I told him everything, starting with the affair and ending with Alec's phone confession. Klaus took notes and asked specific questions about timing and witnesses. Then he explained that if the toxicology proved intentional poisoning, Alec could face felony animal cruelty charges. He was straightforward about the process being difficult. It could take months to resolve. Prosecutors sometimes didn't take animal cases seriously enough. Juries could be unpredictable. But he thought we had a strong case based on what I'd told him. The phone confession was powerful even without a recording. The timing right after losing in divorce court showed motive. And if the toxicology came back showing poison, that would prove method. He asked if I wanted to move forward, and I said yes without hesitation. Klaus had me sign papers giving him permission to access all my divorce records. He wanted copies of the evidence I'd used in court, including the photos of Alec and Rachel kissing and the screenshots from their couple's account. He thought Alec's pattern of vindictive behavior would be relevant to proving intentional cruelty, rather than accident. Someone who would publicly conduct an affair while married, then try to take everything in divorce court, then murder his ex-wife's dog in retaliation. That showed a clear pattern. Klaus said he'd coordinate with Detective Silas and Prosecutor Viviana Luna, who handled animal cruelty cases in our county. He'd call me as soon as the toxicology results came in. The call came 6 days later. Piper's voice was gentle but firm as she explained what they'd found. My dog died from antifreeze poisoning. The chemical ethylene glycol was present in extremely high concentrations in his system. She explained that antifreeze poisoning is one of the most painful ways for an animal to die. It takes hours. The animal experiences seizures, difficulty breathing, and organ failure. The amount found in my dog's system was far too high to be accidental exposure. Someone had to have deliberately given it to him. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat in my kitchen and cried for the first time since finding out he was dead. Not just crying, but sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. Anya heard me from upstairs and came running down. She held me while I fell apart. Klaus called that evening after speaking with Piper. He said the toxicology results were exactly what we needed. The high concentration proved intent. The timing proved motive. And Alec's confession to me on the phone proved knowledge. Klaus was filing a formal police report and meeting with Viviana Luna tomorrow. Meanwhile, Detective Silas was working on establishing a timeline. He'd been interviewing my neighbors to see if anyone saw Alec at my house around the time my dog would have died. I asked Klaus what happened next, and he said we wait. Wait for the prosecutor to decide whether to file charges. Wait for Silas to finish his investigation. Wait for the legal system to move at its own pace. I hated waiting, but I didn't have a choice. 2 days later, Silas called with news. The neighbor across the street remembered seeing Alec's car parked in my driveway the day after the court hearing. She remembered because she thought it was strange since everyone knew we were divorced. She'd seen him arrive around 2 in the afternoon and leave about 40 minutes later. That was when I was staying at Ania's apartment, so I wasn't home. My dog would have been in the backyard alone. Silas said this testimony, combined with the toxicology results and the phone confession, gave them a solid timeline. Alec had opportunity, means, and motive. The prosecutor was reviewing everything now to decide on charges. The call came 2 days later from Detective Silas. He'd been canvassing the neighborhood more thoroughly and found something. A house 2 doors down had security cameras covering their driveway and part of the street. The homeowners gave him access to the footage from the day after the court hearing. I listened as he explained what the video showed. Alec's car pulling into my driveway at 2:17 in the afternoon, sitting there for 40 minutes, then leaving at 2:57. The timestamp matched exactly when I was at Ania's apartment and my dog was home alone in the backyard. Silas said this was the evidence they needed to establish opportunity. Combined with the toxicology results showing deliberate poisoning and Alec's phone confession to me, they had a solid case. He was meeting with Klaus and the prosecutor tomorrow to review everything. I thanked him and ended the call, then sat staring at my phone for probably 20 minutes. The footage proved Alec had been at my house, proved he had access, proved he was there during the exact window when my dog died. Klaus called me that evening after his meeting with Viviana Luna. She was filing charges. Felony animal cruelty with intent to cause suffering. He explained that Viviana was tough, experienced, and took these cases seriously, even though some prosecutors didn't. She wanted to meet with me personally before moving forward, but she'd already decided to pursue this. The preliminary hearing would be scheduled within a few weeks. I asked Klaus what happened next and he walked me through it. Arrest warrant issued. Alec taken into custody. Arraignment where he'd enter a plea. Then we'd start building the case for trial. His voice was calm and professional, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath. We had him. The evidence was there. The timeline was clear. Alec had murdered my dog, and now he'd face consequences. 3 days later, Silas called to tell me Alec had been arrested. They'd gone to his new apartment early that morning and found him there with Rachel. According to Silas, Alec acted completely shocked when they put the handcuffs on. He denied everything. Claimed I must have misunderstood what he said on the phone. Said it was a joke that I took seriously because I was unstable from the divorce. Silas said Alec kept insisting there was no proof, that the security footage just showed him visiting his old house to pick up mail, that the antifreeze poisoning must have happened some other way. But they arrested him anyway and took him to county jail for booking. The arraignment was scheduled for the next day. I didn't attend the arraignment because Klaus said I didn't need to be there. But he called me afterward with news that made my stomach turn. Rachel had posted bail. She'd used money from her late husband's life insurance policy to pay the bond and get Alec released within hours of his arrest. Klaus explained this actually worked in our favor for trial. It showed their relationship was serious enough that she was willing to spend thousands of dollars to get him out. It proved the affair wasn't just content creation like Alec claimed during the divorce. A jury would see that Rachel was financially supporting him now, which demonstrated the depth of their involvement. But knowing she'd used her dead husband's money to bail out my ex-husband made me feel sick anyway. That same week, I started having panic attacks. Real ones, not just anxiety. I'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced someone was breaking into my house. I'd hear normal sounds like the furnace clicking on or the house settling, and my heart would start racing. So fast I thought I was dying. I couldn't eat without feeling sick. Couldn't focus at work. Couldn't sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. Anya finally convinced me to call a therapist. She found someone named Lucille Combs who specialized in trauma and grief. I made an appointment for that week, figuring it couldn't hurt, even though I didn't really believe talking about my feelings would help anything. Lucille's office was in a quiet building downtown with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that probably cost a fortune. She was older than I expected, maybe in her 50s, with kind eyes and a direct way of speaking that I appreciated. She didn't try to make small talk or ease into things. She just asked me to tell her what happened. So I did. I told her about the divorce, the affair, the court battle, finding out about my dog, the investigation, the arrest. She listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, and when I finished, she said something I wasn't expecting. She told me this wasn't just about losing my dog. I started to argue, but she held up her hand. She explained that my grief was about multiple layers of betrayal and violation. The affair, the lies, the vindictive cruelty of killing something I loved, the violation of coming to my home, my safe space, to commit murder. The realization that someone I'd trusted for years was capable of causing that kind of suffering deliberately. My dog's death was the focal point, but the trauma went deeper. She said we'd work on processing all of it, not just the surface grief. We scheduled twice-weekly sessions. I left feeling exhausted but somehow lighter, like someone finally understood that this wasn't just about a pet. Meanwhile, living alone in my house became impossible. Every night I'd lie awake listening to every sound, convinced Alec would come back. He'd proven he was willing to break into my property and hurt something I loved. What would stop him from doing something worse? The restraining order felt like paper, meaningless against someone who'd already crossed every line. Anya noticed I was falling apart. She started staying over on weekends, then a few nights a week, then finally just moved into my guest room temporarily. She brought over some clothes and toiletries and set up camp like it was no big deal. Having her there helped. I could sleep knowing someone else was in the house, knowing I wasn't alone if something happened. But I still couldn't go into the backyard. The flowers where I'd buried my dog were dying from lack of water. I could see them from the kitchen window, brown and wilted, but I couldn't make myself walk out there. Couldn't stand on that ground. Couldn't look at that spot without seeing my dog's small grave and thinking about how Alec had poisoned him. Anya offered to water them for me, but I told her to just leave them. Let them die. I didn't want anything growing there anyway. Klaus called with an update about the defense strategy. Alec's attorney, Travis Wolf, was claiming the poisoning was accidental. Their story was that Alec had been doing yard work at his own property, and my dog must have gotten into antifreeze there somehow. It was obviously a lie since I'd had full custody of the dog after we separated, and he'd never been to Alec's new apartment. But Travis was going to argue it anyway, trying to create reasonable doubt. Klaus said not to worry. The security footage, the timeline, and the phone confession made their accident theory impossible to believe. But we needed to be prepared for Travis to attack my credibility, to paint me as a bitter ex-wife making false accusations. Viviana scheduled a meeting with me to start preparing for potential trial. Klaus came with me to her office downtown in the prosecutor's building. Viviana was exactly like Klaus described, tough and direct with no patience for games. She sat across from me and explained bluntly that animal cruelty cases were hard to prosecute because some jurors didn't take them seriously. Some people saw pets as property, not family. We needed to be ready for that bias and overcome it with evidence and testimony. She asked if I was prepared to testify about my relationship with my dog, about what he meant to me, about finding out he was dead. I told her yes. She nodded and started making notes about our trial strategy. She asked me to describe my relationship with my dog, how long I'd had him, what our daily routine looked like together. I told her about adopting him from the shelter 6 years ago, how he'd sleep at the foot of my bed every night, how he'd wait by the door every evening when I got home from work. Viviana wrote everything down and then asked about Alec's attitude toward the dog. I remembered all the complaints over the years about vet bills being too expensive, about the dog shedding on the furniture, about him barking too much when Alec was trying to sleep in on weekends. Viviana wanted to know if Alec had ever hurt my dog before or threatened to. I told her no, nothing physical, but he'd say things like the dog was a waste of money, or that I cared more about the animal than about him. She made more notes and explained that this pattern of resentment would help show the jury that Alec had motive beyond just spite over the divorce. Klaus walked me out to my car after the meeting and told me I did well, that Viviana was tough but fair, and she clearly believed we had a strong case. I drove home feeling drained from reliving all those memories about my dog and Alec's attitude toward him. 3 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Eric Larson, someone Alec and I used to hang out with before the separation. We hadn't talked in months because most of our mutual friends had picked sides or just disappeared entirely. Eric sounded uncomfortable on the phone, asking how I was doing, making awkward small talk before finally getting to why he called. He'd heard about the charges against Alec through the neighborhood gossip, and something had been bothering him since he found out. A few days after my divorce court hearing, Alec had met up with Eric for drinks and mentioned something about taking care of the dog problem. Eric thought Alec meant he was going to give the dog to someone else or rehome him, not that he meant something violent. But after hearing about the poisoning charges, Eric realized what Alec had actually been talking about, and it made him sick. He asked if there was anything he could do to help, if his information would be useful to the police. I told him to hold on and immediately called Klaus on three-way. Klaus got excited the second Eric repeated what Alec had said about the dog problem. He explained that this statement proved Alec was planning to harm my dog before it happened, which showed it wasn't some random act of anger but something he'd been thinking about for days. Eric agreed to meet with Detective Silas and give an official statement. Klaus scheduled it for the next morning and thanked Eric multiple times before hanging up. After Eric got off the phone too, Klaus told me this was exactly the kind of evidence that would destroy Travis's accident defense theory. If Alec was talking about taking care of the dog problem days before the poisoning, there was no way it could have been accidental exposure to antifreeze. I felt a tiny bit of relief knowing we had more proof, even though it didn't change the fact that my dog was still gone. The following Monday, I forced myself to go back to work after taking a week off. My boss had been understanding about needing time for a family emergency, which is what I'd told her without explaining the details. My coworkers knew about the divorce because I'd had to take time off for court dates, but nobody knew about my dog being murdered. Walking into the office felt surreal, like I was moving through water, everything slow and distant. I sat at my desk and stared at my computer screen, unable to focus on emails or remember what projects I'd been working on before everything happened. One of my coworkers asked if I was feeling better, and I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak without crying. I made it through the day by going through motions, responding to messages without really reading them, attending meetings without hearing what anyone said. By the time I got home, I was exhausted from pretending to be functional. Anya came over that evening and found me sitting in my car in the driveway, unable to make myself go inside the empty house. She got in the passenger seat and we sat there for 20 minutes before she suggested we go back to her apartment for the night. Over the next few days, she helped me figure out a routine that might keep me from falling apart completely. Therapy with Lucille on Tuesdays and Thursdays, work on weekdays even though I was barely present, and spending weekends at Ania's apartment to get away from my house. The structure helped in a mechanical way, giving me a schedule to follow even though I was just going through the motions. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, eat something, go to bed, and then do it all again the next day. I wasn't really living, just existing from 1 hour to the next. During one of my Tuesday therapy sessions, Lucille brought up the idea of a grief support group specifically for pet loss. I immediately resisted because my situation felt different from people whose pets died of old age or illness. My dog was murdered by someone who wanted to hurt me, which seemed like a totally different kind of loss. But Lucille pushed gently, explaining that grief is grief, regardless of how the loss happened, and being around people who understood that pets are family might help me feel less alone. She gave me information about a group that met Thursday evenings at a community center across town. I took the paper but told her I'd think about it, not really planning to go. The next Thursday, I showed up at the community center anyway. The support group met in a small room with chairs arranged in a circle, and there were maybe 8 other people there. The facilitator was kind and explained the format, then people started sharing stories about their pets. One woman talked about her cat who died after 15 years, how she still expected to see him on the windowsill every morning. A man described his dog who got hit by a car, how guilty he felt for not keeping him on a leash. Each story made me cry harder until I was sitting there with tears running down my face, unable to stop. But there was something comforting about being in a room with people who got it, who understood that losing a pet isn't just losing an animal, but losing a family member. When it was my turn to share, I couldn't get through more than a few sentences before breaking down completely. The facilitator told me it was okay, that I could just listen for now, and several people nodded at me with understanding in their eyes. A few days later, I was scrolling through social media when a message notification popped up from Rachel. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. She'd written this long paragraph about how she didn't know what Alec had done to my dog, how she felt terrible about everything, how she wanted me to know she never would have supported something like that. The message felt fake and calculated, like she was trying to cover herself legally or make herself feel better. I blocked her immediately without responding, and then called Klaus to tell him about the contact attempt. He sounded concerned and asked me to screenshot the message before blocking her, which I'd already done. He explained that any contact from either Alec or Rachel could be considered witness intimidation, since I was going to testify against Alec in the criminal case. Klaus told me to document any future contact attempts from either of them, no matter how small or innocent they seemed. He said he'd send formal letters to both Alec and Rachel, as well as their attorneys, warning them against any further contact with me. The letter would make it clear that continued contact could result in additional charges, and would be presented to the judge as evidence of intimidation tactics. I felt slightly safer knowing there would be official documentation telling them to stay away from me, even though I didn't really trust that a letter would stop them if they wanted to reach out again. 2 weeks later, Klaus called with news about the preliminary hearing date. It was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which gave us time to prepare, but also meant 6 more weeks of waiting and anxiety. Klaus explained that the preliminary hearing was where a judge would review the evidence and decide if there was enough to proceed to trial. He seemed confident we'd move forward based on the toxicology report, security footage, neighbor testimony, and Eric's statement about Alex bragging. But he warned me that I'd have to attend the hearing and possibly testify, which meant seeing Alec in person for the first time since he'd been arrested. The thought of being in the same room with him made my hands shake, but I told Klaus I'd be there because I needed to see this through for my dog. Those 6 weeks dragged by in a weird mix of too fast and too slow. I started seeing Lucille twice a week instead of once, and she taught me this breathing thing where I had to count to 4 while breathing in, hold for 4, breathe out for 4. It felt stupid at first, sitting there counting my breaths like a kid, but when I practiced it at home, I could actually feel my heartbeat slow down a little. She also made me practice grounding exercises, where I had to name 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, and 1 thing I could taste. The point was to pull me back to reality when my brain started spinning with worst-case scenarios about the hearing. We did mock testimony prep too, where Lucille pretended to be a lawyer asking me questions about my dog, about the divorce, about my anxiety. The first time she asked me to describe finding out what Alec did, I started crying so hard I couldn't finish the sentence. By week 4, I could get through the whole story without completely breaking down, though my voice still shook and I had to keep stopping to breathe. Anya came with me to most of the therapy sessions, sitting in the waiting room with her laptop so she could work while I was inside. She'd taken on extra projects at her job so she could bank time off for the hearing, and I felt guilty watching her stress over deadlines because of me. At home, I practiced the breathing exercises every night before bed, lying there in the dark counting and trying not to think about walking into that courtroom. I bought new clothes for the hearing because Lucille said looking put together would help me feel more in control, even if I was falling apart inside. The night before the hearing, I barely slept, just laid there staring at the ceiling and running through everything Klaus had told me to expect. Anya picked me up at 7 in the morning, way too early for the 10 o'clock hearing, but I'd been awake since 5 anyway. She'd brought me coffee and a bagel that I couldn't eat, my stomach too twisted up to handle food. The drive to the courthouse took 30 minutes and neither of us talked much, just sat there listening to some podcast she'd put on to fill the silence. I kept doing the breathing exercises in the passenger seat, counting in my head while watching the buildings go by. When we pulled into the courthouse parking lot, I saw Klaus waiting by the entrance, and seeing him there in his suit made everything feel suddenly real in a way it hadn't before. We walked through security together, putting our bags and phones through the scanner while guards watched us with bored expressions. The courthouse hallways smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee, with people in suits rushing past us carrying folders and briefcases. Klaus led us to a waiting area outside the courtroom, and that's when I saw Alex sitting on a bench across the hall with Travis. My hands started shaking immediately, this uncontrollable tremor that spread up my arms and into my chest. Alec looked comfortable, relaxed even, leaning back against the wall like he was waiting for a dentist appointment instead of a hearing about murdering my dog. Travis was talking to him quietly, probably going over their strategy, and neither of them looked worried at all. I sat down next to Anya and shoved my hands under my legs to hide the shaking, pressing them flat against the wooden bench. Klaus sat on my other side and went over what would happen one more time, but I could barely focus on his words because I kept glancing across the hall at Alec, waiting for him to look over and see me falling apart. The bailiff called us in at exactly 10 o'clock, The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with only about 6 rows of benches for observers and a judge's bench that sat higher than everything else. We filed in and took our seats at a table on the left side while Alec and Travis sat at an identical table on the right. The judge came in a minute later, an older woman with gray hair pulled back tight, and everyone stood up until she told us to sit. The preliminary hearing started with Travis standing up to argue that the evidence against Alec was weak and based on assumptions. He talked about how the security footage only showed Alec's car, not Alec actually doing anything wrong. He claimed the phone call where Alec told me about my dog being buried in the backyard was just a sick joke taken out of context, that Alec had a dark sense of humor but would never actually hurt an animal. Travis made it sound like I was this unstable ex-wife trying to frame Alec because I was bitter about the divorce, twisting innocent comments into evidence of a crime that never happened. I had to sit there listening to him paint me as some kind of crazy person, while my hands shook in my lap and my breathing got faster despite all the exercises Lucille taught me. The judge listened without showing any expression, just taking notes while Travis talked for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 minutes. Then Viviana stood up and everything changed. She pulled out the toxicology report first, walking the judge through exactly what killed my dog and how much antifreeze was in his system. She explained that the amount found meant it couldn't have been accidental exposure, that someone had to deliberately give it to him, probably mixed in food to mask the taste. Then she showed the security footage on a laptop, the timestamp clearly showing Alec's car arriving at my house during the window when my dog died. She called up the neighbor from across the street who testified that she saw Alec get out of his car and go into my backyard, staying for about 30 minutes before leaving. Viviana presented Eric's written statement about Alec bragging about taking care of the dog problem, and she read parts of it out loud to show Alec had been thinking about this before it happened. The judge watched all of this with a focused expression, leaning forward to look at the footage and the toxicology report more closely. When Viviana finished, she turned to look at Travis and Alec with this cold stare and asked if the defense had anything else to add. Travis started to argue again about circumstantial evidence, but the judge cut him off, saying she'd heard enough. She flipped through her notes for maybe 3 minutes, then looked up and stated there was clear probable cause to proceed to trial on felony animal cruelty charges. Just like that, in less than 10 minutes of deliberation, she decided the case would move forward. We all stood up as the judge left, and that's when Alec turned to look directly at me. His face was tight with anger, eyes narrowed, and he stared at me like he was trying to communicate some kind of threat without words. I felt my whole body go cold under that stare, my breath catching in my throat despite all the grounding techniques I'd practiced. Klaus put his hand on my arm and guided me toward the exit, but I couldn't stop looking back at Alec standing there with Travis, both of them watching me leave. When we got out to the hallway, I saw Rachel waiting by the main doors, dressed up nice like she was there for moral support. She walked over to Alec the second he came out and grabbed his hand, and they headed toward the exit together without looking back at me. I stood there frozen in the middle of the hallway while people flowed around us, and suddenly my stomach lurched and I thought I might actually throw up right there on the courthouse floor. Anya grabbed my other arm, and she and Klaus basically held me up while walking me outside to where the air was cold and clean and I could breathe again. That night was the worst I'd had since finding out about my dog. I got home around 2 in the afternoon and tried to distract myself with TV, with cleaning, with anything that would keep my brain from replaying Alec's stare in the courthouse. But by 8 o'clock, I was pacing around my house, checking every window lock twice, looking out at the dark street for any sign of his car. My breathing got fast and shallow, my chest tight like someone was sitting on it, and my hands were shaking so bad I dropped my phone trying to text Ania. The panic attack hit full force around 9. This overwhelming terror that Alec was going to come back to my house and hurt me since my dog wasn't there to protect me anymore, or even warn me if someone was outside. I couldn't catch my breath, couldn't think straight, just kept walking from room to room, checking locks and windows over and over. Ania called me at 9:30 to check in, and I could barely speak, just gasping out words between sobs about how Alec was going to come back, how I wasn't safe, how the locks weren't enough. She stayed on the phone with me while calling Lucille's emergency line on her own phone, and within 10 minutes, Lucille called me back. We did a phone session right there at midnight, with me sitting on my kitchen floor doing the breathing exercises while Lucille talked me through the panic. She reminded me that Alec was under scrutiny now, that coming near me would only make his legal situation worse, that he had too much to lose by trying anything. It took almost an hour, but eventually my breathing slowed down, and the panic faded to just regular fear and exhaustion. Klaus called me 2 days later about filing for a restraining order. He'd been thinking about my safety concerns and the way Alec stared at me in the courthouse, and he thought we had grounds to request protection. I told him about the panic attack, about how I couldn't sleep, because I kept imagining Alec showing up at my house, and Klaus said that was exactly the kind of thing judges took seriously when deciding on restraining orders. He filed the motion that afternoon, citing the intimidation at the courthouse, my legitimate fear based on Alec's past actions, and the need to protect me during the criminal proceedings. The hearing for the restraining order happened a week later, much faster than I expected, and the judge granted a temporary order without much debate. Alec had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my house, and my workplace, and violating it would mean immediate arrest. Klaus got the official paperwork to me the next day, and I kept a copy on my phone, another copy in my purse, and the original in a folder at home where I could grab it fast if I needed to. The restraining order helped some, knowing there was legal protection between me and Alec, but I still couldn't sleep without checking all the locks multiple times before bed, walking through the house testing every door and window to make sure they were secure. I'd check them once at 9, again at 10, and usually one more time around midnight before I could even try to sleep. Anya noticed during one of her visits and suggested getting a security system installed, something with cameras and motion sensors that would alert me if anyone came near the house. We spent the next weekend setting it up together, mounting cameras at the front door, back door, and both sides of the house where someone could approach without being seen from the street. The system connected to an app on my phone that would send alerts and let me watch the camera feeds in real time. Installing everything took most of Saturday and part of Sunday, drilling holes for the mounts and running wires and syncing everything to my Wi-Fi. When we finished, I felt slightly better knowing I'd have warning if Alec tried anything, that I wouldn't just wake up to him breaking in without any alert. But watching the security camera feeds became its own problem pretty fast. I started checking the app constantly, pulling out my phone every few minutes to scroll through the 4 camera views and make sure no one was near my property. At work, I'd check it between tasks, during lunch, even in the bathroom. At home, I'd have the app open on my phone while watching TV, glancing down every few seconds to scan for movement. I checked it before bed, in the middle of the night when I woke up, and first thing in the morning. The app showed every car that drove past, every neighbor walking their dog, every delivery person approaching houses on my street. I'd zoom in on each person to make sure it wasn't Alec or Rachel, my heart jumping every time I saw someone who looked even slightly similar. Anya pointed out that I was checking the cameras more than I was actually living my life, but I couldn't stop because what if the one time I didn't check was when Alec showed up and I missed the warning? Lucille brought it up in our next therapy session, asking how often I was checking the security feeds. I tried to downplay it at first, but she pushed, and I admitted I was probably checking 20 or 30 times a day, maybe more. She didn't tell me to stop or act like I was being crazy, which I appreciated. Instead, she explained that my hypervigilance was a trauma response, that my brain was stuck in threat detection mode because Alec had proven he was actually dangerous by killing my dog. She said it made sense that I'd want to monitor everything after he violated my safety that way, but the constant checking was keeping me in a state of high alert that prevented any real healing. We talked about how to gradually reduce the checking without leaving myself feeling vulnerable, starting with setting specific times to look at the cameras instead of checking whenever anxiety spiked. Lucille helped me see that while my fear was valid and based on real danger, letting it control every minute of my day was giving Alec power over me even when he wasn't physically present. The work of healing, she explained, would be learning to feel safe again without needing constant confirmation that threats weren't approaching. Klaus called 2 days later with news about the trial date. He explained they'd scheduled it for 3 months out, which gave us more time to prepare, but also gave Travis more time to build whatever defense he was planning. I asked if that was good or bad, and Klaus said it depended on how I looked at it, that the extra time meant I could work with Lucille to get into a better mental state for testifying, and we could prepare more thoroughly for cross-examination. The way he said it made me realize how much work was still ahead of me, that I couldn't just show up and tell my story without falling apart. After we hung up, I sat staring at my calendar, counting the weeks until the trial date and feeling my stomach twist at how far away it seemed and how close at the same time. That weekend, I decided I needed to do something about the backyard. The flowers where I'd buried my dog were completely dead now, brown and withered from weeks of me avoiding that whole side of the yard. Just looking at them through the kitchen window made me feel sick. I called a landscaping company and explained I needed someone to remove some dead plants and help me create a new garden bed in a different location. The guy who came out didn't ask questions about why I wanted to move everything, just measured the space and gave me a quote. When he started pulling up the dead flowers, I went inside and turned up the TV so I couldn't hear the digging sounds. Anya came over while the work was happening and we sat together not talking much, just being in the same room while strangers fixed what I couldn't face fixing myself. By the end of the day, the dead flowers were gone, and there was fresh dark soil on the other side of the yard, far away from where my dog was actually buried. The landscaper planted new flowers there, bright yellow ones that looked nothing like what I'd had before. Anya suggested we create a memorial in the new garden area, something I could visit without having to stand where my dog was actually buried. We went to a garden store and I picked out a smooth gray stone, big enough to matter but not so big it looked like a grave marker. The store offered engraving, so we had them add my dog's name and the years he was alive. When we brought it home and placed it among the new yellow flowers, I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite relief, but maybe the smallest bit of peace. Anya squeezed my hand and told me it looked perfect. I couldn't speak, so I just nodded. That night, I sat by the kitchen window looking at the memorial stone in the dark, lit by the backyard security light, and cried harder than I had in weeks. But it felt different somehow, like I was crying because I missed him instead of crying because I was drowning. The next few weeks were strange because I started having good days mixed in with the terrible ones. Some mornings I'd wake up and get through my entire shower before thinking about Alec or the trial. Other days I'd make it all the way to work before the anxiety hit. I felt guilty every time I had a good moment, like I was betraying my dog by not being sad every single second. When I told Lucille about it, she got excited and called it progress, explaining that grief doesn't mean suffering constantly, and that having good moments didn't mean I loved my dog any less. I wanted to believe her, but the guilt stuck around anyway. She told me that was normal too, that I'd been through something horrible, and my brain needed to learn that it was okay to feel okay sometimes. Klaus started meeting with me every week to prepare for trial testimony. We'd sit in his office and he'd make me practice answering questions, starting with easy ones about my relationship with my dog, and gradually moving to harder ones about the divorce and what Alex said on the phone. Then he'd switch and ask me the kind of aggressive questions Travis would probably use, things about my mental state and whether I was making things seem worse than they were for sympathy. The first few practice sessions went okay because Klaus was being gentle with me. But as we got closer to the trial date, he started pushing harder, explaining that I needed to be ready for Travis to attack my credibility and my emotions. During one session, Klaus asked me to describe the moment I found out my dog was dead, the exact words Alec used, and how I felt hearing them. I made it about halfway through before I started crying so hard I couldn't breathe. Klaus handed me tissues and waited until I calmed down before explaining that I needed to be able to get through that testimony without falling apart, or the jury wouldn't hear the full story. He wasn't mean about it, but he was firm, telling me that showing emotion was fine, but I couldn't let the emotion stop me from speaking. We practiced that part over and over until I could say the words without completely breaking down, though my voice still shook and tears still ran down my face. Klaus said that was okay, that the jury needed to see I was genuinely hurt, but also needed to hear the actual facts of what happened. Then Viviana called with news that made everything more complicated. She'd reviewed my security footage from the past few weeks and found 2 instances of Alec driving slowly past my house, which violated the restraining order. She was adding those violations as additional charges. I felt this weird mix of vindication and terror because on one hand it proved I wasn't crazy for being afraid, but on the other hand it meant Alec was willing to risk arrest just to drive past my house. When I asked Viviana what Travis would say about it, she sighed and told me he'd already claimed it was accidental, that Alec was in the neighborhood visiting friends and didn't realize he'd driven past my street. Nobody believed that excuse, but Travis was required to provide some kind of defense. After we hung up, I immediately started parking my car in the garage instead of the driveway, even though it meant clearing out years of stored boxes to make room. Klaus called a few days later, sounding more energized than usual. Eric had agreed to provide additional testimony about Alec's character, specifically describing times during our marriage when Alec was cruel or dismissive toward my dog. Klaus explained this was pattern evidence that would be powerful for the jury, because it showed Alec's poisoning wasn't a random act, but part of a longer history of not caring about my dog's well-being. I asked what kind of incidents Eric remembered, and Klaus read from his notes. Things like Alec complaining about vet bills, refusing to let my dog on the furniture, making jokes about getting rid of him. Hearing those memories from an outside perspective made me realize how many red flags I'd ignored during the marriage, how I'd convinced myself Alec's attitude toward my dog was just normal guy stuff instead of genuine cruelty. I forced myself to keep attending the pet loss support group even on weeks when I didn't want to talk or be around people. Some sessions I'd just sit there listening to other people share their stories, not contributing anything except occasional nods. But being in that room with people who understood that pets were family members, not just animals, helped me feel less alone in my grief. Nobody there questioned whether I was overreacting or suggested I should be over it by now. They just accepted that losing a pet to murder was traumatic, and that healing would take as long as it took. One woman whose cat had died from kidney failure told me she was glad I was pursuing justice, because she wished she'd had someone to hold accountable for her loss. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just thanked her and tried not to cry again. Anya started packing up her things about 2 weeks later, folding clothes and putting them in bags while I watched from the doorway. She told me she needed to get back to her own place but would call every single day, and we made a plan for her to come over every weekend. The first night alone felt weird, but not as scary as I thought it would be, and having my phone next to me with her number ready helped me fall asleep. We talked every morning before work and every night before bed, just checking in about small stuff like what we ate for dinner or what show we were watching. The weekends became something I looked forward to instead of dreaded, knowing she would show up Saturday morning with coffee and stay until Sunday evening. Klaus called me on a Tuesday morning and told me to take the whole week off before trial because we needed to go over everything multiple times until I could recite it in my sleep. I put in for vacation time at work and drove to his office that Monday, where he had files spread across his entire conference table. We spent hours going through the toxicology report line by line, with Klaus explaining what each number meant and how it proved the poisoning was intentional. He made me look at the security footage over and over, watching Alex's car pull into my driveway and park there for 40 minutes before leaving. The neighbor testimony got reviewed next, with Klaus pointing out exactly which details were most important for the jury to hear. Eric's statement about Alec bragging came last, and Klaus practiced asking me questions about my friendship with Eric to establish he was a reliable witness. By Wednesday, my head hurt from all the information, but Klaus kept pushing because he said Travis would try to confuse me on the stand. He made me practice answering hostile questions without getting defensive or crying, which was harder than I expected. Klaus would pretend to be Travis and ask things like whether I was making up my grief for attention or if I actually cared about my dog at all. The first few times I got mad and snapped back, but Klaus explained that losing my temper would make me look unstable to the jury. We practiced my answers until I could stay calm even when he asked the worst possible questions, my voice steady while describing how much my dog meant to me. Thursday and Friday, we went through my entire testimony from start to finish, with Klaus timing how long each section took. Lucille scheduled 3 extra sessions that week, meeting with me Tuesday evening, Thursday morning, and Friday afternoon to help me handle the stress. She taught me this breathing technique where I counted to 4 while inhaling and 6 while exhaling, which was supposed to keep my heart rate steady. We practiced visualization exercises where I imagined myself on the witness stand staying calm and focused, picturing exactly how I would sit and where I would look. Lucille reminded me that showing emotion was okay, that I didn't need to act like a robot, but I also didn't need to completely fall apart. She explained that jurors would respond to genuine emotion, but get uncomfortable if I seemed too dramatic or over the top. The night before trial, I barely slept, lying in bed running through my testimony and trying to remember all of Klaus's advice. Anya showed up at 6 in the morning even though we didn't need to leave until 8, bringing me coffee and a bagel I couldn't eat. She picked out my clothes because I couldn't decide what to wear, settling on simple pants and a sweater that looked respectful but not fancy. The courthouse was downtown in an old building with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. Klaus met us in the lobby and walked us through security, then up to the 3rd floor where the courtroom was located. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly yellow. Alec was already sitting at the defense table with Travis, both of them in suits, and seeing him made my stomach flip. Anya grabbed my hand and squeezed hard, and I focused on breathing the way Lucille taught me instead of staring at Alec. We sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, and I kept my eyes on Viviana as she organized her files. The judge came in and everyone stood up, then we all sat back down and the trial officially started. Viviana stood up for her opening statement and walked toward the jury box, her voice clear and strong as she started talking. She told them about a man who lost everything in divorce court because of his own choices, a man who decided to get revenge by killing his ex-wife's dog. She described how Alec had bragged to friends about what he did, thinking he was clever enough to get away with murder. Viviana laid out the evidence piece by piece, explaining how the toxicology report, security footage, and witness statements all pointed to one conclusion. She told the jury about the antifreeze poisoning and how painful that death would have been, making several jurors look uncomfortable. When Viviana finished and sat down, Travis stood up and buttoned his suit jacket before walking to the jury. He painted a completely different picture, calling me a bitter ex-wife who couldn't accept the divorce and wanted to punish Alec. Travis claimed the evidence was circumstantial and could be explained away, suggesting the poisoning might have been accidental. He told the jury that I had mental health issues and a history of anxiety, implying I wasn't stable enough to be trusted. Travis said Alec was the real victim here, targeted by a vindictive woman who wanted to destroy his life after losing him to someone else. Listening to him twist everything made me grip the bench so hard my knuckles turned white, but Anya kept her hand on my arm to keep me calm. The prosecution spent the next 2 days presenting evidence, starting with Piper taking the stand to explain the necropsy results. She walked the jury through the toxicology report using charts and diagrams, showing exactly how much antifreeze was in my dog's system. Piper testified that the amount was far too high to be accidental exposure, that someone had to deliberately give it to him. The security footage got played on a screen for everyone to see, showing Alec's car clear as day in my driveway with the timestamp visible. My neighbor took the stand next and described seeing Alec's car that afternoon, remembering it because she thought it was strange he was there when I wasn't home. Eric testified about Alec's comment regarding taking care of the dog problem, explaining he didn't understand what Alec meant until he heard about the poisoning. Travis tried to make Eric seem unreliable during cross-examination, but Eric stayed calm and repeated exactly what Alec had said. On the third day, Klaus walked me to the witness stand and I put my hand on the Bible while the clerk asked if I swore to tell the truth. My voice shook when I said yes, and I sat down in the wooden chair facing the entire courtroom. Viviana started with easy questions about my marriage and divorce, letting me warm up before getting to the hard stuff. I described my relationship with my dog, how long I'd had him, what our daily routine was like. She asked about the divorce proceedings and how Alec reacted to losing, and I explained about his threats on the phone. When Viviana asked me to describe the phone call where Alec told me about my dog, my voice cracked, but I got through it without crying. I told the jury exactly what he said about checking the backyard under my flowers and how I knew immediately what he meant. Klaus had prepared me well enough that I managed to explain everything clearly, even though my hands were shaking the whole time. Travis stood up for cross-examination, and his first question was whether I was exaggerating my grief to gain sympathy from the jury. He asked if I really loved my dog, or if I was just using this situation to hurt Alec more. Travis suggested I was mentally unstable from the divorce and couldn't be trusted to tell the truth about what happened. He implied that maybe I had poisoned my own dog to frame Alec, asking if I had access to antifreeze. The questions kept coming, each one worse than the last, and I had to remind myself to breathe and stay calm. Travis asked if I was angry enough at Alec to lie under oath, if I wanted him to go to prison just because he left me for someone else. I answered each question the way Klaus taught me, keeping my voice steady and not getting defensive. When Travis finally sat down, Viviana stood up for redirect and asked me one simple question about whether any amount of anger would make me hurt an animal I loved. I looked right at the jury and explained that my dog was family, that losing him to murder was different from natural death. I told them that no matter how mad I was at Alec, I would never harm an innocent animal who depended on me. Several jurors were nodding, and one woman in the back row had tears in her eyes. The next day, Travis called his first witness, a woman from Alec's gym who talked about how he always stopped to pet dogs in the parking lot. Then came a coworker who said Alec donated to animal shelters every year through workplace giving. A third witness described how Alec once helped rescue a stray cat from under a car. Each person spoke for maybe 10 minutes, and Travis looked pleased with himself, like these stories proved something important. But sitting there listening, I could see the jury wasn't buying it. The physical evidence was too strong, and these feel-good stories about Alec being nice to random animals didn't match up with him poisoning my dog out of spite. Travis rested his case after just one day, and never called Alec to testify, which Klaus had predicted. Because putting Alec on the stand would let Viviana tear him apart with questions about the divorce and his affair, and that phone call where he told me to check under the flowers. The judge dismissed us for the day and explained that closing arguments would happen tomorrow morning. Then the case would go to the jury. Closing arguments took most of the next morning. Viviana walked the jury through every piece of evidence one more time, building a timeline that showed Alec had means, motive, and opportunity to poison my dog. Travis argued that the prosecution hadn't proven beyond reasonable doubt that Alec specifically fed antifreeze to my dog, suggesting it could have been accidental exposure somehow. But his argument felt weak and desperate compared to the security footage and Eric's testimony about Alec bragging. The judge gave the jury their instructions around noon, and they filed out to deliberate. Anya and I got moved to a small victim advocate room with uncomfortable chairs and old magazines nobody wanted to read. A volunteer brought us sandwiches, but I couldn't eat anything, my stomach too twisted up with anxiety about what the jury might decide. 6 hours felt like 6 years. I kept checking my phone even though Klaus said they'd come get us the second there was a verdict. Ania tried to distract me with random conversation, but I couldn't focus on anything she said. Every time footsteps passed in the hallway outside, I jumped up thinking it was time, then sat back down disappointed when they kept walking. Around 6 in the evening, Klaus knocked on the door and told us the jury had reached a verdict. Walking back into that courtroom felt surreal. Alec sat at the defense table looking bored, like this was just an inconvenience for him. Rachel was in the gallery behind him wearing sunglasses inside like she was some kind of celebrity. The jury filed in, and none of them looked at Alec, which Klaus had told me was usually a bad sign for the defendant. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman stood up holding a piece of paper. My hands were shaking, so bad I had to grip the edge of the bench. The foreman read out guilty on the felony animal cruelty charge, guilty on the first restraining order violation, guilty on the second restraining order violation. Alec's face stayed completely blank like he felt nothing at all, but behind him Rachel started crying loud enough that the judge had to tell her to be quiet or leave. Klaus squeezed my shoulder and whispered that we'd won. I felt relief wash over me, but also this weird emptiness because winning the case didn't bring my dog back. 2 weeks later, we returned for sentencing. The judge gave Alec 2 years in state prison, 5 years probation after his release, mandatory anger management and counseling, and a lifetime ban on owning any pets. He also had to pay restitution for the necropsy and court costs. Alec finally showed some emotion then, his face going red as the bailiff put handcuffs on him and led him away. Rachel tried to follow him, but security stopped her at the courtroom doors. Anya drove me home, and we sat in my backyard where I'd planted the new garden, the memorial stone with my dog's name catching the late afternoon sun. I felt exhausted down to my bones, but also lighter somehow, like maybe I could actually start healing now that justice had been served. The anger and grief would probably never fully go away, but sitting there with my sister in the space I'd reclaimed as my own, I thought maybe someday I'd be okay again.